He saved his father's life at age 12. 3 years later, he slaughtered an elderly couple with surgical precision, and then calmly resumed his day. What transforms a once celebrated child into a remorseless predator? The answer lies deep within a mind few experts believe can ever be redeemed. At 3:12 a.m., the first responding officers forced open the back door of the small suburban home. Inside, the stench of blood saturated the air, warm, metallic, suffocating. What they encountered was not the scene of an interrupted burglary, nor a domestic altercation. It was a calculated slaughter. The master bedroom had become a grotesque tableau. Blood spatter reached across the walls and ceiling, forming patterns consistent with frenzied stabbing. 2 bodies lay side by side on the bed, mutilated beyond immediate recognition. Oliver, Chip Northup, aged 87, and Claudia Maupin, aged 76, were both subjected to extreme overkill. Multiple deep stab wounds concentrated in the torso, face, and neck. Wounds were clustered and overlapping, a pattern often indicative of emotional release rather than controlled execution. Further forensic analysis revealed deliberate post-mortem manipulation. A drinking cup had been inserted into the abdominal cavity of the male victim, while a mobile phone was found lodged inside the female victim. These acts serve no functional purpose. Rather, they represent signature behaviors, psychologically driven expressions of control, degradation, and a possible compulsion to shock those who would later discover the scene. This level of post-mortem desecration suggests that the offender experienced sustained excitement during and after the act. The crime was not impulsive. Entry was gained via a carefully cut window screen at the rear of the house, an indicator of planning. The perpetrator left minimal forensic trace, further supporting the hypothesis of premeditation. The choice of victims appeared opportunistic. There was no apparent personal connection between the offender and the couple. This randomness, combined with the ritualistic elements, points toward a paraphilic or compulsive motivation, rather than a targeted vendetta. Initial behavioral hypotheses identified a likely offender profile: young, male, exhibiting psychopathic traits, with an established fantasy life centered on violent themes. The staging of the crime scene indicated familiarity with both violent imagery and criminal procedure. The offender had deliberately altered his footwear to obscure prints, a forensic countermeasure uncommon among adolescent offenders. The timeline of events at the scene also provides insight. Evidence suggested the offender remained inside the house for an extended period post-murder, possibly upwards of 20 minutes. This behavior is significant. In cases of purely instrumental violence, committed for gain or immediate emotional retaliation, the offender typically departs rapidly. In contrast, lingering suggests gratification derived from domination and the aftermath of the act itself. Combined with the excessive number of wounds and the anatomical precision of some injuries, this pattern aligns with offenders who possess both sadistic impulses and a fascination with human anatomy. It is not uncommon for such individuals to engage with violent media, dissection imagery, or other content that eroticizes the destruction of the human body. At this stage of the investigation, one pressing question emerged. Had this act served to satiate the offender's compulsions, or had it merely whetted an appetite for further violence? The answer would soon become critical. Daniel Marsh presented a unique psychological profile that had been taking shape long before the events of that night. His developmental history reveals an accumulation of risk factors that, in combination, created an ideal foundation for the emergence of predatory behavior. The early disintegration of his family environment had profound effects on his emotional and cognitive development. His parents' volatile relationship, subsequent divorce, and his mother's abrupt departure created a landscape of abandonment, mistrust, and unresolved anger. These factors, well documented in criminological research, are known to disrupt normal attachment processes and distort a child's emerging sense of self and others. Reports from educational and clinical settings indicate that Marsh exhibited symptoms of depression, social withdrawal, and affective flattening from an early age. More notably, by age 10, he had already begun experiencing persistent violent ideation. His first detailed fantasy involved the murder of his mother's new partner. Such ideation at this developmental stage is rare and signals an early crystallization of cognitive scripts around violence as a form of emotional regulation. As he progressed into adolescence, these fantasies generalized beyond the initial target. By age 14, Marsh described experiencing intrusive thoughts of harming virtually anyone he encountered. This pattern, violent imagery generalized to strangers, acquaintances, and even family members, is indicative of a breakdown in normal empathic processes. Clinical interviews later revealed that he no longer experienced guilt or emotional discomfort in response to these thoughts. Instead, he began to derive a sense of fascination and, eventually, gratification from them. The role of media consumption in this evolution should not be understated. Marsh cultivated a deep obsession with violent imagery, particularly through online platforms that catered to extreme subcultures. His repeated exposure to depictions of mutilation and death served to normalize these themes within his cognitive landscape. Such conditioning is known to desensitize the subject, lowering effective barriers to actual violence. Peers later reported observing Marsh's increasing preoccupation with gore, weapons, and anatomy. He demonstrated an unusual fascination with the internal structure of the human body, often linking this curiosity to his violent fantasies. In this context, his later post-mortem manipulation of victims' bodies appears less as random degradation and more as an extension of this morbid interest. Concurrently, Marsh's interpersonal relationships began to deteriorate. Reports of manipulative behavior, shallow charm, and calculated cruelty emerged during this period. These traits align closely with Factor 1 components of the psychopathy checklist, revised, specifically interpersonal and affective deficits. Of particular concern were documented instances of cruelty to animals, carrying concealed weapons, and openly discussing homicidal thoughts with peers, each a validated, predictive marker for future interpersonal violence. Institutional responses to these warning signs were fragmented and insufficient. Despite multiple interventions by school counselors and mental health practitioners, no cohesive risk management strategy was implemented. The absence of coordinated monitoring allowed Marsh's internal fantasy life to deepen, unchecked. By the time of the offense, Marsh had progressed beyond fantasy rehearsal to active planning. He had tested various entry methods, experimented with forensic countermeasures, and selected tools specifically suited to his intended act. His statements following the crime confirmed that the act was not reactive, but a deliberate fulfillment of long-standing compulsions. Such a trajectory is consistent with developmental models of compulsive predatory violence. The offender's internal schema evolves over time, reinforced through cognitive rehearsal, media consumption, and isolated fantasy, until the perceived need to actualize the fantasy overrides remaining inhibitory controls. At this point in Marsh's evolution, a key variable remained to be understood. What psychological mechanism had finally shifted him from preparation to action on that specific night? The investigation was now focused on uncovering this critical trigger. On the night of the murders, Daniel Marsh entered what criminologists identify as the final escalation phase of compulsive predatory violence. Leading up to this point, he had experienced weeks of mounting internal pressure, driven by intrusive homicidal ideation that had become more frequent and vivid. According to post-arrest interviews, Marsh described an overwhelming sense of agitation and an inability to concentrate on daily activities. This state is consistent with the pre-offense tension-building stage observed in individuals with compulsive violence profiles. By approximately 2 a.m., Marsh prepared for action. His behaviors were highly ritualized. He dressed in black clothing, selected gloves and a ski mask, and retrieved a hunting knife. He also applied tape to the soles of his shoes, a sophisticated forensic countermeasure designed to obscure any identifying tread patterns. The specificity of these preparations reflects cognitive rehearsal and a desire for control over both the environment and the investigative process. Marsh did not set out with a predetermined target. Instead, he wandered through the neighborhood, testing doors and examining windows. This opportunistic victim selection process indicates that his primary goal was the act itself, rather than retribution against a specific individual. Such a pattern is common in offenders where the violence serves an intrinsic psychological function. Upon discovering a vulnerable entry point at the Maupin Northup residence, Marsh proceeded to cut the window screen and enter the home. His movements inside the house were deliberate. He located the bedroom and spent several minutes silently observing the sleeping couple. This delay is significant. In many cases, a pause before initiating violence offers a window for internal conflict or inhibition to surface. In Marsh's case, the absence of withdrawal underscores the depth of his detachment and the dominance of his compulsive drive. The attack commenced with extreme force. Marsh inflicted dozens of stab wounds to each victim, far exceeding what would have been necessary to cause death. The spatial distribution of the wounds, clustered in vital areas, but also extending to the face and limbs, indicates a combination of goal-directed violence and expressive aggression. The presence of defensive wounds suggests that the victims awoke and attempted to resist, which may have further heightened Marsh's arousal. Post-mortem behaviors provide additional insight. The insertion of foreign objects into the victims' bodies and the staging of the crime scene reflect a need to assert dominance and leave a lasting imprint. This is not merely an attempt to confuse investigators. It is an act of psychological gratification. Marsh's fascination with anatomy and dissection likely informed these actions, transforming the crime scene into a personal tableau that mirrored elements of his internal fantasy life. After the attack, Marsh remained in the home for a significant period, manipulating the scene and confirming the deaths. His physiological state, as later described in interviews, involved a sense of euphoria and relief, consistent with the release phase of the compulsive violence cycle. Notably, he exhibited no signs of panic or remorse. He disposed of some clothing and returned home, where he resumed normal activities. This level of post-offense composure further validates the presence of entrenched psychopathic traits. Subsequent disclosures by Marsh revealed a critical detail. Far from experiencing satiation, the act had intensified his desire for further violence. He described thoughts of future murders and began formulating plans to vary his methods and victim selection. This progression aligns with the escalation pattern seen in emerging serial offenders, where initial acts serve to lower inhibition and reinforce the violent behavioral schema. As the investigation advanced, attention shifted to Marsh's post-crime behaviors. How would he navigate social interactions and the investigative scrutiny now closing in around him? The answers would emerge during the next pivotal phase, the interrogation. When Daniel Marsh entered the interview room, he demonstrated a controlled and carefully composed demeanor. His posture was relaxed, his tone measured. This outward calm, in the face of a double homicide investigation, was itself indicative of an underlying effective detachment. Early exchanges with investigators were marked by vague responses and strategic omissions. Marsh relied heavily on non-committal language, using phrases such as, "I think," and "I'm not sure," a common tactic employed to maintain plausible deniability while avoiding outright falsehoods. Throughout the initial phase of questioning, Marsh displayed little physiological arousal. His breathing remained steady, his blink rate normal. This level of autonomic control is consistent with high-functioning psychopathy, where the individual is capable of masking internal anxiety, even under significant external pressure. As investigators gradually introduced evidence, such as testimony from acquaintances and digital traces linked to violent interests, Marsh's behavioral strategy began to shift. he adopted a posture of incredulity, occasionally offering rehearsed affirmations of empathy and normalcy. For example, he stated that he cared about people and could never hurt anyone. However, these statements were delivered without congruent effect. The mismatch between verbal content and nonverbal cues is a hallmark of deceptive presentation in psychopathic subjects. When confronted with more specific evidence implicating him directly, Marsh exhibited brief micro-expressions of contempt and amusement, followed by an immediate return to a neutral facade. These involuntary cues, though fleeting, suggest a sense of superiority and a belief in his ability to manipulate the outcome of the interrogation. A notable transition occurred once a second more experienced interviewer, a profiler, entered the room. This interviewer employed rapport-building techniques, framing Marsh's actions in terms of psychological compulsion rather than moral failure. Marsh responded to this reframing with increased verbal engagement, providing more detailed descriptions of his internal states. This willingness to discuss aspects of the offense without full admission reflects a need for recognition and an underlying narcissistic trait structure. As the interview progressed, Marsh began to offer partial disclosures. He acknowledged intrusive, violent thoughts and a fascination with anatomy, but initially denied any direct involvement in the murders. When presented with irrefutable evidence, including corroborated witness statements, he gradually shifted to a minimization strategy. He described the killings as something he had to do due to overwhelming compulsion, a narrative consistent with offenders who seek to mitigate culpability by framing their actions as uncontrollable. Marsh's eventual full confession was delivered with a disturbing level of detachment. He recounted the events with clinical precision, devoid of visible remorse or emotional disturbance. His descriptions of the sensations experienced during the act, particularly the feelings of exhilaration and satisfaction, underscore the compulsive and effectively charged nature of his violence. One critical observation emerged during the latter stages of the interrogation. Marsh openly admitted to ongoing homicidal ideation and the formulation of future plans. He expressed a desire to refine his methods and explore new victim profiles. This candid acknowledgement is significant. It indicates that the initial murders had not served to resolve his compulsions, but rather had reinforced and intensified them. At this juncture, the investigative team faced a pressing question. Given Marsh's expressed intentions and psychological profile, could any form of intervention realistically disrupt his trajectory toward further violence? The resolution of this question would soon inform the legal and clinical strategies to follow. Following Daniel Marsh's confession, a comprehensive psychological evaluation was conducted. His profile revealed deeply entrenched psychopathic traits, marked by an absence of empathy, shallow affect, and pervasive violent ideation. The structured clinical assessments confirmed what had become evident during interrogation. Marsh derived intrinsic psychological gratification from the act of killing and exhibited no genuine remorse. His statements regarding the murders were consistent with what forensic psychologists classify as compulsive predatory violence. The killings were not reactive, nor were they driven by external pressures or transient emotional states. They were the culmination of a long-standing fantasy life, reinforced through rehearsal and internalized as a central component of his identity. Moreover, Marsh's admission of ongoing homicidal thoughts and his expressed desire to continue refining his methods provided clear evidence of an escalation trajectory. In cases of this nature, the initial act of violence often serves to lower remaining inhibitions and validate the offender's internal schema. Without effective intervention, the risk of further violence remains high. During legal proceedings, Marsh was tried as an adult, reflecting the gravity of the offense and the clinical consensus regarding his dangerousness. His behavior throughout the trial remained consistent with his earlier presentation: calm, detached, and intermittently manipulative. Observers noted a marked absence of effect when confronted with victim impact statements and forensic evidence. The question of potential rehabilitation was rigorously debated. Research on the treatment of individuals with high psychopathy scores indicates limited efficacy. Traditional therapeutic approaches, particularly those reliant on the development of empathy and guilt, are unlikely to produce meaningful change. In Marsh's case, his high score on the psychopathy checklist, revised, placed him well within the range associated with recidivism and treatment resistance. One of the more concerning aspects of this case lies in the subject's intellectual capacity and manipulative skill. Marsh demonstrated the cognitive ability to construct convincing narratives and to superficially conform to social expectations when it served his interests. This capacity increases the potential for deceptive compliance within controlled settings, complicating risk management upon potential release. The broader implications of this case are significant. It underscores the necessity for early identification of risk factors, particularly in adolescents presenting with violent ideation, cruelty to animals, and fascination with death. It also highlights the limitations of current intervention models in addressing the needs of individuals whose pathology is as deeply rooted as Marsh's. At present, Marsh remains incarcerated, with parole eligibility decades away. Whether any future interventions can meaningfully alter his trajectory remains uncertain. The clinical and criminological consensus suggests that absent profound internal change, the core drivers of his violence are unlikely to diminish. Ultimately, this case serves as a stark reminder of the rare but profound danger posed by individuals whose minds become fully entwined with violent fantasy. It reinforces the critical importance of vigilance, multidisciplinary collaboration, and the continual advancement of forensic assessment and intervention strategies to better protect both potential victims and society at large.